Hello everyone. This is our first online lecture. So today we'll be discussing the end of the Persian Empire and the period known as Hellenism that comes with Alexander the Great's conquering of the Persian Empire. So as we saw in the last few weeks, the Achaemenid Persians lasted more than 2 centuries. They maintained major city plans, including Babylon, while they were also building their own cities or rebuilding the cities of Susa and Persepolis. So the Achaemenid Persian Empire really comes to an abrupt end with the rise of Alexander of Macedon. So in 331 BCE, Alexander defeats Darius III and his Persian army at the Battle of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia. Here we can see a map of some of the military campaigns. And once Alexander defeats Darius, the Persian king actually flees to the east. However, when he arrived at his destination, he was actually murdered by several of the satraps that had governed the area. If we remember, the satraps were those governors that Persian kings put in place to maintain control of certain areas. So this is a really interesting concept where the people that the Persians had treated so well, had made governors of certain areas, would turn against their own king. So we can surmise this as the start of a new political order, and these Persian satraps wished to appease the Macedonians and be spared from Alexander's wrath. So Alexander the Great is associated with what is called the Hellenistic era. This comes from the term Hellenes that's listed on this slide here. The term Hellenes is just the term that ancient Greeks used to describe themselves. So instead of saying they were Greek, they would call themselves a Hellene. And this is not specific to any city-state. Hellenes included all Greeks from Sparta, Athens, etc. So Alexander the Great regarded himself as heir, actually, to not only the Greek Empire, but also the Persian Empire. And he saw himself as the kind of new ruler of Babylon. We already talked a little bit about how Babylon is this kind of fantastical, sort of mysterious city that has a great appeal for many rulers, even in the modern era. So before we get to the kind of artwork produced after Alexander takes over, let's take a look at how he was actually able to take over. So in ancient Greece at the time, you do not have a unified state. Instead, the Greeks were composed of individual city-states. After the kind of golden period of ancient Greece in the earlier 5th century, you have the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was fought between 2 leading city-states in ancient Greece, Athens and Sparta. Other Greek city-states would form alliances with both sides. Eventually, the powerful Athens was defeated, but Sparta had also been weakened. This ultimately led to the downfall of the Greek Empire. The Greeks would eventually be conquered by Macedonia, led by Alexander the Great, and then later by Rome. From that point on, Greece would no longer be an independent city-states that had pervaded for centuries. So, at this time, Macedon, geographically, we can see here, if you look, the purple area is ancient Greece. You have the Illyrians up to the northwest, the Thracians to the northeast. The Persian Empire we can see there in what is now modern-day Anatolia. So that's where the Hittite Empire used to be as well. So Macedonia is this very small area, but then Philip II, who was Alexander the Great's father, comes into extreme power in the sense that he actually learns a lot of different techniques of war from the Greeks and actually uses that to take over the Illyrians, Thracians, and then ultimately the Greeks. So this gives Alexander, or basically equips him, with the best army in the world, or what is now the best army in the world. So Alexander, at the age of 20, inherits this empire and starts to conquer and expand that inheritance. So Alexander as well, I want to take a moment, if you look at the third point down, we've been talking about how certain rulers or certain civilizations like the Assyrians versus the Persians have this tendency, or at least they have these kind of different political policies. So Alexander, here we have the example of the city of Thebes that was razed to the ground. Now, what's interesting here is that Alexander spared the house owned in the previous century by the poet Pindar. So Pindar was a very famous ancient poet, still is to this day. So let's think about that for a moment, that Thebes was a city that uprised against or rebelled against Alexander, so he had to serve it as an example. But he spared the culture. So there's still this kind of important trend of taking over a culture, but maintaining one's respect for the art and the architecture. We've also been talking about the dissemination of portraiture, and we'll be seeing a lot more of that. So in our video from Nigel Spivey on How Art Made the World, talking about Darius the Bowman, just a reminder about these coins. The political logo is created by Darius the Bowman. Again, the Bowman had those qualities of leadership, of calmness, of discipline, and military prowess. So this was a wonderful symbol that he could use to help expand his power. The video also talked about Alexander the Great, how he's influenced by this and takes this inspiration, but instead of a political logo, he creates the first political portrait and then places his own face on money. So this is a wonderful type of propaganda that allows his face to be extremely recognizable all throughout the controlled lands. But it's with the death of Alexander that the kind of greatness of the Hellenistic period ends. So Alexander had conquered the lands from the Ionian Sea to the Punjab, from the Caucasus to the borders of Ethiopia. We'll be seeing a map here in a moment. So he dies in 323 BCE at the young age of 32. So what happens to the empire afterwards is that Alexander's generals actually split the empire amongst one another. And initially, they were on the same side, but then as time grew on, many of them became power-hungry and had political disputes with the others. So here's the map that we can see. At the very top one in the orange, we have the Persian Empire. So this is a massive empire reaching all the way up to the Macedonian border. So the Macedonians and the Persians, as well as the Greeks, we've already talked about the relationship between the Greeks and the Persians. So the Macedonians would have been aware of this. They would have been aware of the power of ancient Persia, as well as their conquering of Egypt. And when we look at the map of Macedonia, we can see that it literally just kind of picks up all of the territory that had been previously ruled by the Persians, with a little bit more eastward focus after Alexander's conquering. So this map in particular shows Alexander's route as he's moving through. So the type of artwork that comes out of the Hellenistic period. Pliny the Elder was a sort of philosopher and a writer on art, and he's from the ancient world, ancient Greece, and he tells us about the painters who had lively personalities with great technical innovations. And these achievements, we will see, can be viewed in mosaics, specifically the Roman mosaic that we viewed in the video as well. So we'll be taking a little bit closer look at how that was made, as well as some of the techniques that they're using. So some of these are foreshortening. Foreshortening is reducing or distorting an image to create a sense of depth and space. So we'll talk about how that's used here in a moment. You also have the use of modeling, or creating three-dimensional appearance with the use of light and dark tones. We have expressions of emotion, light, and perspective as well. So we'll see radical changes in the artwork of ancient Greece, Macedonia, as well as Mesopotamia. So mosaics, Greek mosaics were a very common artistic practice that later transferred to Rome. A mosaic is an artwork made up of tiny squares of stones, glass, or ceramic pieces, known as tesserae. So tesserae are these individual pieces, and they're assembled to make a pattern or look like an image. If you go to this URL, this shows you how the mosaic is made, and this is just a very kind of small area that this artist is demonstrating on. So I want you guys to take a look at this video and think about the process of what they would have to go through. In particular, pay attention to how they actually make the tesserae and the kind of skill that is involved with that. So this is the mosaic that depicts one of the most important battles in ancient history. So as we're looking through this, I want you guys to think about the process of making the mosaic that you just saw in that YouTube video. And as we're going through in the details, think about how difficult it would have been to actually make this mosaic. So this battle, specifically in the middle of a turning point, it's the moment when the great ruler of Persia turns and flees under the onslaught of Alexander the Great. So Darius III was the king of the Persians at this time, and we can see that it's just the moment he has ordered his troops to retreat. So this moment literally just took place. We can see some soldiers that are turning away and fleeing, while others have yet to make the turn to retreat. And we can see that the Persian spears are starting to point left on the right side of the canvas. So on the right side, you have the Persian army and Darius III. On the left side, you have Alexander the Great and the Macedonian army. Unfortunately, that's the majority of the mosaic that has been damaged. So the spears, as well as the direction, create implied lines for the eye. So this allows the viewer's eyes to really kind of move across the canvas in a kind of dramatic motion. So this is met by another implied line coming from the opposite direction. So we're getting this sense of tension, of kind of pushing and pulling together as well. There's a lot of expressive movement, as well as Darius's chariot turns around. We'll have a detail coming up here in a moment. So all of this movement is used to create a sense of tension that would have been felt by those involved in this battle. So the artist is trying to give the viewer an idea of what it would have been like to be in this battle. So this is not just depicting emotions of the subjects represented, but attempting to evoke it within the viewer as well, which was a characteristic of Hellenistic art. So the Persians we see fleeing as Alexander confidently charges forward. Many of the Persians as well have fallen and are represented dead or dying on the ground. So one of the most interesting parts that we have here is of Darius. So you can see Darius, His hand is kind of outstretched as if he's almost pleading for Alexander to have mercy on him. We see his Persian soldiers on the ground. There's also the horse, which is where the use of foreshortening is coming in. So again, that's the distortion of forms to create an illusion of depth. So if you have a figure, whether that's a human figure or an animal figure, rather than representing them in profile or composite view, you represent them in this way. So foreshortening is used to create a realistic illusion, which is different from ancient Mesopotamian art, which instead wanted to give you the most information. So another interesting part I want to point out here is in the bottom right corner. You can see that there's a man that's lying on the ground. He's actually looking at his own reflection in the shield. So, as we discussed a few moments ago, artists are studying the effects of light and reflection, making the artwork even more complex, naturalistic, and innovative. So, let's take a look at how modeling is used here. So here is an even closer detail. And again, thinking back to the process of making a mosaic, think about all these tiny pieces of tesserae, all of the different colors being used, and not just the different colors, but the different shades and tints of the colors. We can see the highlights from the sun shining on this man's face. There's shadows beneath his eyes, where the hair and clothing are casting those shadows. We can even see that the figure has remnants of facial hair on his mustache area. So this is an incredible amount of detail and artistic skill being represented here. So now let's take a look at the two rulers depicted in this scene. So you have Alexander leading the Macedonian and Greek armies, and Darius with the powerful Persian army. So take a look at their facial expressions. Again, it almost appears as if Darius is pleading with Alexander. We can see that his brow is furrowed. He has this kind of terrified look about him. And Alexander is very strong, that we see here. So these rulers, this is again that political propaganda that is talking about Alexander's success, his might over the greatest empire that had ever existed up to this point. So once Alexander had conquered this vast amount of territories, he set up settlements and populated them with Greek residents. So this is a similar idea to what the Assyrians actually did, where they introduced Assyrians, or at least loyal subjects, in cities where uprisings were prominent. However, the Macedonian army, or under Alexander, rather populated them with Greeks. So they become intermixed and more of a kind of multi-ethnic metropoli. So this began a cultural change known as Hellenization. So Hellenization, the term itself, comes from the Hellenes. So we'll see Greek artworks were imported with this influx of Greek residents and mixed into a new hybrid of Mesopotamian and Greek art. So Alexander makes his grand entry into Mesopotamia, and he specifically chooses Babylon as one of his key urban centers. And interestingly, he actually rebuilds or reconstructs the Esagila, or the Temple of Marduk, and other architectural projects were instituted during his reign, as well as rebuilds. So we see that the Greek influence on Mesopotamian art spreads very rapidly because of the rapid pace that Alexander really expanded and penetrated the Persian Empire. So Greek and Macedonian artists are traveling eastward. They're bringing these new styles with them. They would also set up in Mesopotamian workshops where they interacted with the local traditions and artisans. We know that Greeks had lived in Assyria and Babylon as early as the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. So there had always been this kind of interaction between them, However, not to this extent. The visual shift that we see is the result of the larger influx of Greco-Macedonians to settlements established by Alexander. This female statue is a figure that we know very well, actually. This is a statue of the goddess Ishtar. So if we remember, Inanna was the goddess of war and love, later called Ishtar. So this statue is one of a number of alabaster figurines that combines elements from Greek and Mesopotamian culture. So in the Greek, we can see that there's an intention to creating three-dimensional or realistic three-dimensional forms and a kind of ideal body type, but there's Babylonian features and decorative elements. So let's take a look at the individual parts here. So the Ishtar statue, we can see a detail and the full statue in the center. The artwork to the right is the Venus, or excuse me, let's see. It's a Venus sculpture by Praxiteles. Praxiteles was a extremely well-known artist of ancient Greece. He was very well known as well for popularizing nude female imagery, but these would only be images of the goddess of love. So we see the attention to the realism and idealization of the body. So there's an emphasis on the rounded hips and thighs that adhere to the Greek ideal of feminine beauty, but this also kind of coincides with the emphasis that was on, say, the Venus of Willendorf, or those Venus figurines that we learned about at the very beginning of the semester. So the positioning as well, the body type, we can see this more realistic influence coming from Greece. But the Babylonian attributes are, of course, the belly button as well as the eyes are actually inlaid with rubies. So there's still that idea of inlaying precious materials in important areas. You also have jewelry, gold jewelry specifically, a necklace, and these two earrings that are being represented. And as we have seen with the Syrians, Neo-Babylonians, the wearing or adornment of jewelry, even going all the way back to the third dynasty of Ur and Queen Puabi, has been a common Mesopotamian practice. We can also see on top of Ishtar's head is a kind of Greek version of the horned helmet. So we can still see that there's two horns, but it actually starts to make the shape more of a crescent. So as I mentioned, after the death of Alexander, one of his generals, Seleucus I, became king of a large region that included the majority of Mesopotamia. So Seleucus, you can see he's the orange area here. So he has the majority of the Tigris and Euphrates areas. So the Fertile Crescent, we can see in the green, the Antigones are in that area and would have their own kind of kingdom. So soon after taking control of Mesopotamia, Seleucus founded his new city of Seleucia on the Tigris River. This also begins the Seleucid Empire. As this was a new city that was not built upon a more ancient site like Babylon or Uruk, it became the ideal Hellenistic city that deliberately combined visual conventions from both East and West, as it was not bound to any specific tradition or visual tradition. So this torso we can see from on the left, and if you compare them with sculptures from the very famous Parthenon in Athens, we can certainly see the clear Greek influence. There is a sense of this dramatic body movement, this contortion where you can see the muscles tensing as this figure is kind of hunching forward a little bit. We see movement being depicted, although we no longer have the head or the appendages. We can see that this would have been a dramatic pose. There's also the careful details of how the muscles and the bones are responding naturally to the movement of the body. So, although Egyptians were actually the ones who taught the Greeks how to sculpt, we see that the Greeks have gone, by this point, completely in their own direction. So no longer kind of replicating those same pharaonic statues. We can definitely see this when we compare Seleucid art to Assyrian. So when we look at the bodies of the Assyrians and their artwork, we talked about how naturalistic it looks and much more realistic than any art before it. But we can see that compared to the Seleucid style, the anatomy or the study of anatomy is much more significant in the Macedonian tradition. However, that's not to say that studying animals, human figures for ancient Mesopotamian artists was not important. As we can see here, it very much was. But the ultimate goal was not to represent them as you see in nature. We're still using profile views, frontal views in ancient Mesopotamia, again, to create that clarity of the narrative. Hercules is a popular hero from the Iliad and Odyssey. You guys may be very familiar with him. He was also referred to as Heracles. So this statue comes from Seleucia in the 2nd century BCE. So Heracles is a prominent figure in Greek culture and was also admired by Mesopotamians as a semi-divine hero figure. So we talked about the representations of the hero in ancient Mesopotamia, particularly around the time of Naram-Sin, Sargon I. You have these hero priest king images where the king is very fit and strong, but also intelligent. So Heracles is the kind of perfect candidate for being admired as a hero, even in the Mesopotamian tradition. So what we do see as well is the continued use of bronze casting. So when we looked at the Hittite Empire, we saw with the seated goddess, that golden statue, that they were using the lost wax casting method. So the Greeks, the Seleucians are using these techniques as well that were perfected for this specific type of artwork. We also see the use of classical Greek styles and visual motifs, such as the use of contrapposto. Now, contrapposto, contra meaning against or contradict, posto, pose or position. So this position and this sculpture in particular, this is Polyclitus's Doryphorus, also known as the spear bearer. The Greek word doru, it refers to a very long spear, which would have taken great athletic skill to wield. We can see that in his left hand, this is probably where the spear would have gone, which is now lost. So the idea of contrapposto is we can see that if you bisect the body down the middle, you can see that the right leg is in an activated position, the left arm is in an activated position, whereas the opposite is true for the other side of the body. So we have the right arm being at rest, the left leg being at rest. So it's this balance of opposites on the body, as well as an attention to tilting the hips, as well as the shoulders. So this makes a sculpture appear exceedingly realistic. Think about when you guys are kind of standing around, you're just kind of relaxing. You're not standing in a very rigid pose. Instead, you're probably leaning on one foot, so your hips tilt. So by doing this in sculpture, this is imbuing the sculpture with that sense of life that the Greeks so desired. Here's actually a little cartoon for you guys. It's just something that I always find very funny, but it's a little joke about contrapposto being introduced into Egypt. Lastly, we'll take a look at the Greek influence on Mesopotamian architecture, specifically the city of Hatra. Hatra was located on a trade route south of modern-day Mosul in Iraq, and in ancient times was known as the City of the Sun. It was first constructed in the Seleucid era, but continued to be used during the Parthian era that we will learn about in our next lecture. Unfortunately, like Nimrud, much of this site was destroyed by ISIS. So we have a temple here in Hatra. The type of temple is what you call peristyle. This comes from the Greek word peri, meaning around, and stylos, meaning columns. So basically a perimeter of columns. As you can see in the picture to the right, or the architectural plan, each of those dots represents a column. The naos, or the cella, is where the cult statue would be housed. So we can see that the columns are forming as well what you call a colonnade. So a colonnade is just a row of columns on an architectural structure. As well, if you look at the top of the columns, we can see that there is a Corinthian capital, so there's Corinthian influence. The drawing here is kind of the evolution of the Corinthian capital. You may see actually very similar ones around town. Classical architecture is very prominent in America, particularly in Washington, D.C. as well. So what we see here is the stylized motif of the acanthus leaf. So we talked about ancient Egypt and the influence from that and their lotus and papyrus columns. So that idea of replicating the natural world in stone. So this is something that the Persians reappropriated as well. If you think back to the columns at Susa and Persepolis that had the double-headed bulls at the top and had papyrus and lotus motifs on the shaft. So Greeks used the acanthus leaf. It's the name of a genus that derives from the Greek term akanthos, the name of the plant in Greece. So it's basically kind of a weed actually that grows throughout Greece. So just like the Egyptians were replicating the lotus and papyrus flowers and plants from the Nile River, something that was very central to their life, the Greeks are kind of falling in line with this type of tradition. So let's take a look at the column from Hatra. So we can see that influence there, where you have the kind of organic plant feature being replicated in stone. All right, so for our next lecture, we will be talking about Parthian art and culture. So review the PowerPoint presentations. Let's see. Well, that's incorrect, of course. So museum essay is due April 20th. So that's a typo, so please do not adhere to that date. Your museum essay is due April 20th. Remember to compose at least one single-spaced page of notes for each lecture, so you should have 6 total when we come back to class on April 30th. So April 30th is when we come back to class. Museum essay is due April 20th. So I will see you guys next time.